we have in common between our three speakers, their brilliance and the fact that each of them will be trying to focus on phenomenon of anti-Semitism in France today. I would say looking at things, first of all, from the same point of view, because they're going to focus on the same anti-Semitism, but each of them will be looking at this from his or her own point of view. And I think that's why it's so interesting, because we will have contrasting points of view here. To introduce our first speaker, I have to say that unfortunately Georges Bensoussan was able to come today, and he has asked me to speak instead of him. Georges has he uses to publish various writings which are more polemical in nature and which are directly related to the topic that he is going to address. I'm thinking of his book, which was very successful, which was written with a whole group, called Les Territoires Perdus de la République, the Lost Territories of the Republic. Georges Bensoussan is a doctor of history. He's been working on the Holocaust, the Shoah memorial in Paris, and also he's responsible for the various publications and journals of this memorial. So I give you the floor for precisely 25 minutes. Thank you, Alain Michel, for that introduction. Since the time is already ticking away, I would say for a long time, as far as these problems are concerned in France, it was claimed that after, back in 1974, the borders of the Republic were closed. They said immigration was zero. But back in 2005, it was stated that every year 300,000 new people came in from Maghreb, Africa, and 68% come from Africa and 22% are from Maghreb. Without going into details, because we won't have enough time to extrapolate all of this, a major proportion of this migratory flow has been very little, if at all, integrated into the French population, and largely they're in the outlying areas, the suburbs. They've been victims in terms of employment and housing, and as a result of a vicious circle, in other words, the fact that they don't have any qualifications, and that is backed up by the fact that they don't speak French well, and they're not successful at school, so they're basically very underemployed and unemployed. So for the last 30 years, in some of the French suburbs, there has been a almost mafia type of economy where people live off handouts, and you can imagine the problems. And that therefore brings us to our topic today. We have phenomena of endemic violence coming from the youngest parts of this population. Back in 2005, police investigations show that out of 430 gang leaders responsible for this, all over France, 87% had French nationality, but 67% were these new French people from the Maghreb, and 17% were of African origin. The police reports also showed the existence of a marginalized society, and the 2005 police reports just took a report that had largely been ignored because politically it was very incorrect, that from the National Education Ministry from back in 2004, who spoke about a counter-society whose morals and ethics basically are in confrontation with those of the majority population. Osama bin Laden is becoming the hero of these populations, and he's a symbol of those values which run counter to those of our society. So on the fringes of the French nation are known as the lost territories of the Republic. The experience of being French isn't experienced in an experiential fashion, but only in administrative firms. You see the great risk of explosions, as you've seen, ethnic violence, and this highlights four really bothersome realities in France that are often ignored. The first is the extreme violence of these groups. In the autumn of 2005, in the suburbs in France, we saw an absolute unleashing of violence that had nothing to do with 1968. The rioters attacked not just the repressive forces, the courts, the police and so on, but also the schools, cultural centers, those institutions which try to integrate such people. And during the 2005 riots, it's been found that the Jews were not looked on as victims. 2005 was basically because of the ruffians, as they were known. When anti-Jewish riots started back in 2000 in France, it was claimed that this was because of ruffians. And you can see that very clearly the anti-Jewish acts since 2000 have been everything other than because of scoundrels and ruffians. It was because of political anti-Jewish approaches. Another bothersome factor for the intellectuals is this. Many parents have come from the Maghreb, and as has been shown, the weight here in the case is a major one of repression in the case of assimilation. The hatred of France has not been sublimated. You can see that in certain rap groups. It's verbalized, and it's mistaken to sublimate by verbalizing. Rather, by verbalizing, it's easier for people to take action. And then a third bothersome fact, yes, there are in certain sectors phenomena of hatred of the West, particularly since September 2001. If you look at Islam.com, you can see on this site, you two parents, this message, you have to bring your children up to hate France. And the fourth bothersome reality, this reality cannot be explained simply because of poverty. There's at least a 10% unemployment. It's not the same sort of poverty back in the 30s, because there's all sorts of social welfare networks preventing people from starving. It's true that there is suffering, even if it's not that of the 30s, but there's another form of poverty, and that can be used to explain how complex the French reality is. This other poverty is one of people's identities being unstructured, an erosion of the frameworks which people feel they belong, particularly the trade unions and the families. There's an absence of fathers in many of the families of the rioters. And there's this real feeling that they don't belong to France. So there is this real destruction of identities, particularly in the case of the young black kids. We saw on the background of riots that they're right at the front of the rioting. It's like an anthropological no man's land. So if you take this area, this habitat, if you like, suburbs, you find this is where the Muslim fundamentalist groups flourish. They're talking about restructuring identities. They take these children and they say that we have to help them find their identity, and in that way we can get a hold on these suburbs. So it's against that background that for a few years now we have had a new form of, and it's a wrong term, Judeophobia developing. The rioters aren't really French. That's true. But back in 2004, the report of the Human Rights Commission said that there were 1,000 anti-Semitic acts for 1% of the population, and very few very few racist incidents. But since 2000, anti-Semitic incidents have continued, even though they're only spoken about to a very small extent. CRIF has reports of this every day, and every 3 days there's a really serious incident somewhere in France. In what are called difficult areas, Jewish children have left public schools, state schools, and Aubin, in his report, and he's not Jewish, says that the Jewish children in France are the only ones who, in this case, have left certain state schools because they no longer are safe there. I would also add that in this difficult context, the role played by Arab satellite TV that's received in France means that the anti-Jewish prejudices which are broadcast, disseminated by these TV stations, this really reinforces the prejudices that we've seen to a great extent in the kidnapping and murder of Ilan Halimi. This Judeophobia has revived a French form of Judeophobia. It was considered that that form of Jewish Judeophobia had vanished, but it's wrong, and now it's revived and been revived here. So what we have is the form of Judeophobia that is of Maghreb anti-Semitism, but there are at least two new things here as well. A science by the political science department in France showed that just recently the level of anti-Semitism in or among what are called the New French was far more marked than in the rest of the French population, and anti-Jewish phenomena concerned 1/3 of those questioned. And even more seriously, this Arab Muslim population disproves the assumption, the theory, that the more educated, the less people are prejudiced. It's not at all true here. If you take the various levels of education, people who have studied at least 2 years after their school leaving examination, you find that people are absolutely just as prejudiced. So among that new French population, education does not change the level of prejudice. And among that population, those who are aged 25 to 30 are the most prejudiced. We have a large population under the age of 30 who have far more anti-Jewish prejudices than the real French phenomenon, if you like, and this is really something utterly unique in the history of France. Let me add the following. If you want to understand anything in this anti-Jewishness, which is new in name only, it's that you really have this resistant cultural aspect. It's very serious for the future in this Arab Muslim background, now French population. We see that the more educated they become, the more tolerant they become with regard to homosexuality, with regard to social questions, with regard to sexual questions in particular. And normally xenophobia goes down. But there's only one point where things do not vary, and that's their anti-Jewishness. So from this, I come on to my next point. This anti-Jewishness cannot be understood if we don't grasp two things. First of all, in the Maghreb today, because the immigrant populations are in constant link with those back home, are being affected by a very violent anti-Jewish wave. I'm thinking of Algeria, Morocco. Just one figure from last year, 83% of Moroccans from Morocco consider that Judaism is the most violent religion in the whole world. But you won't understand anything with regard to what else I'm going to say unless you bear in mind the fact that this is not a new anti-Jewishness. In fact, there's anti-Jewishness in the Maghreb, and in particular in Morocco, predates Israel, predates Zionism, it predates even French colonialism. Just think of the Bateaux Fez 19th century affair in Fez, and just think, and let me just read this out to you, just a few lines from the document. I don't have very much time. 1876, Joseph Alevi was sent by the Alliance to Marrakech to find out whether or not a school of the Alliance Française could be opened there. Alevi came back with a 16-page document. I'll read a bit to you. He says, it's impossible to listen to the and he's talking about the Jews of Marrakech, listen to the tales of suffering of this community without being moved to tears. our co-religionists have never been so dreadfully treated at any time. Just look at what was done to them with regard to the fairs. They have to put their shoes on. You see them leaving the Mela to go and do some errands, and you see that they had to take off their shoes. They had to take off their head covering. This was required, and they suffered terribly. Look at the poor Jewish women who were forced to work practically every day for a tiny amount of money to help their army, and for a woman to not have a veil, they're forced to go out uncovered. The smallest Arab child curses, insults, throw stones at the most venerable Jews. No one can enjoy a moment of security. The government, on any pretext, goes and rounds up a Jew from his home and administers lashes. The taxes are not set down. They will carry on beating them. Some people have received up to 700 lashes, and the wounds that they bear as a result of these beatings will be borne by them to the end of their day. And I remind you how old Herzl was at this time, 16 years old. And the second fundamental point, this anti-Semitism in France at the moment is totally inseparable from a wider political background of an Islamist origin. A tape has been sold in its thousands where a major leader says of the Arab community says Israel has no right to exist. This is bound up with the re-Islamization of France. Let me explain this. We are finding that people are increasingly wanting to go to Mecca and make the pilgrimage. 30 years ago, people were over 70. About 35% are now aged under 30. This is a new phenomenon. There's also more and more conversions to or returns to Islam. As far as conversion to Islam is concerned, according to general information from the police in France, these conversions to Islam are above all on the part of men. 1/3 of them are former prisoners, and 1/3 of them are people who have no school leaving certificate. What does it mean? It means that sometimes, not always, very often people are dropouts. They're kind of Quasi-Lumpen proletariat, and they have no way politically of having any defense, presenting any defense to an ideological attack. There's been a reference to a real shift to Islamization in the neighborhoods on the part of young people, Maghrebians, and these people offer a positive and universalist Muslim identity, quote unquote, to the often marginalized Arab youngsters who often are victims of injustice as well, because that's the complexity of French society. Through Islamization, they're being offered a way out, and they're tempted by radicalization, they're tempted by the hardest line version of Islam, and most of the converts, in fact, have become interested in Salafist Islam. So the imams in recent years and the religious leaders of Islam in general are offering this version. When the French journalists were arrested, we saw that there were Muslim clerics being received by the various ministries. The foreign ministry, we said, who is it who determines France's foreign policy? And secondly, back in November 2005 with the suburban riots, we again saw the Muslim clerics involved, with fatwas being issued by the French Muslim organizations, and they declared that the riots were anti-Muslim, and they told the rioters to go home. So it was necessary sometimes for the religious authorities to intervene in order to quieten down the situation. And Jean-Pierre Revin says in his report, for the first time in our country, Aubin says, the religious question is superimposed on social and national issues. All of these questions, which I've referred to very briefly, are linked. Anti-Jewishness is connected to anti-feminism, the hatred of homosexuality, religious and political clashes and opposition to the Enlightenment. It's at the same time, and I think this is symbolic of the atmosphere, that the BNF, the National Library of France, held a beautiful example on Enlightenment, and Georg Sternheld published a book on the anti-Enlightenments. We really feel that here there is a contesting of the Enlightenment, and everyone is aware of what's going on in France for a long time. Many intellectuals, and above all the media and political world, denied this. The first aspect of denial involves the climate of insecurity. There's a daily atmosphere which is really undermining values. Secondly, there's the unleashing of violence against young whites, as in the last riots, and various sociologists have shown this is an anti-colonial phenomenon where there has been a failure to assimilate. There's major unemployment, a major phenomena of discrimination. In other words, the attackers in what happened recently in France have become victims, and suddenly the status of victim has been constantly highlighted as a way of justifying violence. These self-same French intellectuals have contributed today to this climate which is undermining French society. These intellectuals have often denied these new realities, and they've renamed facts. For example, they talked about this lumpenproletariat of the suburbs using the 19th century slogan, working classes, dangerous classes, but it has nothing to do with them. They may be a political lumpenproletariat. They're certainly not socially speaking, but they may be politically, but certainly not in the classical sense of the term. And if I had time, I would read out various texts by Hannah Arendt with regard to anti-Semitism and the Dreyfus affair, where the leading dignitaries denied the anti-Semitic nature of what was going on. One has to be aware of the fact that our first who were suffering the violence ask a question in an attempt to reach a conclusion. I think really what we're talking about here is the need to analyze this denial of the anti-Jewish violence which is characteristic of this attitude. Firstly, we have to accept that the progressive desire to call this anti-Semitism involves two errors. One is to say that if you say it's not proper anti-Semitism, it means that you're denying the Jews. The Jews think of themselves as subjects, but the enemy, if the enemy says I'm the people, then I am a people. A mistake. Anti-Semitism is never moderate. It's not transient either. It's always going to be exterminatory, as Adorno says, and anti-Semitism always wants to go all the way. Second point, denying the denial of reality in France, where people say you mustn't talk about the ethnic background of those perpetrating violence. People say you mustn't talk about who's doing it, but everybody knows who's doing it. It really, literally makes French society mad, this sort of approach. Third point. In Europe, and I will be very brief here, we're talking of a double movement, in France in particular, a double movement, dual movement with regard to French, to exalt and to reject. To exalt is the Shoah, the victim cult or worship, the Warsaw Ghetto and so on, and then at the same time it means rejecting everything that makes the Jewish people, Assertion, Israel and so on, in this civil religion of the Shoah that is benefiting so many, including in France. The Jews are the people who are responsible first and foremost for this, because they've made it into a pillar of Jewish identity and perhaps of Israeli identity. So it's the Jews who are responsible for having made the Shoah into this form of civil religion. So to conclude, in France, the climate of national hatred is establishing a culture involving excuses and pretext. It means that delinquency is something that is acceptable. No one is responsible. So there is this major crisis where everything involves victimization, so everything can be excused. Secondly, in order to show that the anti-Jewish crisis involves the crisis of the French, nothing is isolated. All of the leftifying culture in France has reduced the history of this country to its darkest pages. This means that the French crisis, or the crisis of French identity, has been made worse. It reinforces the victim identity of those who are newly unaffiliated, and this links up with the slaves, and they're being called the new natives of the Republic. So suddenly there's a new approach to collective memory. They're afraid to commemorate victories. For example, the Austerlitz victory in December wasn't marked last year because Napoleon re-established slavery. So if you're talking about the Jews, then you can throw everything out, baby in the bath. French nation, you have to think about federation above all. And suddenly there's this shift which the Jews are there in the forefront and everybody else is behind them. So we're in the presence of a country which cannot flourish, which is being stripped of its history with a democratic deficit, which is a deficit of citizenship. And this deficit of citizenship means overinvesting in memory. The victim-based competition based on an ethnic identity goes beyond the interplay of memory. It involves a wider crisis in French society, and obviously, doubtless, it encounters Islamic fundamentalism, which is Easternizing, and this involves a link between the Islamists and the ultra-left, as in Tariq Ramadan. And now I really am going to conclude, and I'm going to reassure my friend Michel, who must be very worried. One, France is the only country in Western Europe, I would say, and this has been said, we have to emphasize this, where Islam has covers more than 8 to 10% of the population. This is an exception in Europe. Secondly, the major migratory flow of the last 30 years in France has totally transformed the nature of the country. It's not good, it's not bad, it's a fact that has to be taken into account. It's a sign of the time that has been ignored, that nobody has commented on in France. The major museum of arts in Paris is being closed down because nobody comes to see it, but is going to Marseille. But there's going to be a new museum of migration. That's another sign of development. Thirdly, this crisis of the French nation is nourished by anti-Semitism, but it's not limited to anti-Semitism. France at the moment is very much a country of nostalgia, nostalgia for a rural France which is dead, and also because once rural France died, it went into a real industrial crisis in the 1970s, and you will note a mystery which totally contradicts common opinion. All of the history editors know that it's the First World War that sells, not the Second. Why? Because the First World War was the last great moment where France experienced itself as a major French nation. And hence my now last comments, anti-Jewishness, if you look at a considerable proportion, but not all of the proportion, or all of the population of an Arab background, you have to accept that not everything involves the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Obviously, there is a conflict here, but you have to look at dimitude, the despising of the Jews from Morocco to Yemen. If I had the time, I would have quoted all sorts of other texts to you. All of the texts prove that before 1900, there was a very violent culture of despising the Jews, and this anti-Jewishness also involves resentment. And this culture of resentment means that, and I put quotes before around new anti-Semitism, because this is a culture of resentment which we're very used to. But the rise of Judeophobia in France today is very close to that of the end of the 19th century in terms of resentment. the Bourget de la Villette, the Anti-Semitic League of Jules Verne's, and it's absolutely classic. What is less classic is the imported anti-Semitism, particularly in Maghreb form. And suddenly, therefore, you come up against the question of multiculturalism, which people confuse with multi-ethnicity. These are two different things, because multiculturalism involves the major problem of membership of the nation. You really can't cut out anti-Judaism here, because there's rejection involved here. France is an old state, but it's a paradoxically fragile country. There are so many mechanisms that are being wound down here. There's a great level of resentment in the French nation, and the civil and political feelings of the French at the moment are very similar to those that existed at the end of the Fourth Republic, and how French intellectuals in denying reality. Apart from Alain Finkielkraut and a few more, there are many Jewish intellectuals who pointed their finger at Finkielkraut and others who are in the firing line right at the front. It looks at everyone says the Jews should stay back, and they say, as the community, tribal, emotional, stay out of it. So the Jews again, and this is again a classical 19th century phenomenon, well observed and analyzed by Ahad Ha'am. The Jew interiorizes rejection in order to suffer less from it, classical, trivial, and to a large extent this really corresponds to the memory that Europe has of the Shoah, where in order to understand this strange memory with Europe nourishing or being nurtured by the Shoah, you have to understand that Europe will never forgive what it's done to the Jews. In order to wipe out the persecution that we're victims of, we take the part of the persecutor. So, given what happens is, for a Jewish intellectual, in order to be accepted, you have to provide guarantees of acting well, which means you have to reject Israel, you have to reject Zionism. In the 12th century, it would have been rejecting the Talmud. This is exactly what Ahad Ha'am in 1888, Ahad Ha'am said about the French Jews. They are totally in a condition of slavery in liberty. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much, Georges Bensoussan. We're going to try not to go beyond the time allotted, so we can have. So I'll ask you to reserve the questions to the end of this session, and I have the pleasure now to ask Professor Shmuel Trigano to come to the podium and to make his lecture. I've been able to understand that he has many common denominators with what we've already heard in terms of multiculturalism. Sam Trigano, who's a professor at the University of Nanterre, he's very well known for his numerous publications and lectures. I'd like to say that for me, he is first and foremost, and perhaps this is not what he personally would have chosen as his first business card or personal card, but he directs the College of Jewish Studies of the Alliance in France. It's an institution that has about 20 years, and it is really the place that provides oxygen for Jewish community life in Europe, and we're grateful to him for all his publications, and now the floor is his. If I understood you correctly, you have allowed me 45 minutes of speaking. because we've been asked to speak for 20 minutes, and this is, of course, limited. I'm trying to limit ourselves to the issue which unites us, which is the articulation or a connection of multiculturalism and anti-Semitism, which is a connection, as Professor Vistrich has already said, is quite problematic. I would say that one must accept the idea, at least to my view, anti-Semitism is a political phenomenon and not a psychological one. Well, understanding why Taguieff felt obliged to find the notion of Judeophobia, because, as you know, that in France, the term anti-Semitism is a term that is forbidden because anti-Semitism is a crime by law. So Taguieff has embraced the notion of Judeophobia. However, Judeophobia stems from psychology, mental illness, but not of politics, whereas anti-Semitism is basically a political phenomenon, and one may better understand that with this articulation or connection to anti-Semitism. I'm going to limit myself to an approach which tries to study social morphology, in other words, how societies and groups structure themselves demographically in the field of the imaginary and political field. France is an interesting case in point to the extent that we have here a model which, as a matter of principle, is completely opposed to multiculturalism. France defines itself by its constitution, the Fifth Republic, as the republic which is one and indivisible, whereas its national identity, which is an identity secreted, so to speak, by history, unites itself with the universal. In other words, the very concept of France, of itself, of its own identity, is in many ways obstructed, so to speak. Republican France is, by necessity, shows very little hospitality to phenomena of community or collective identity, whether these collective identities are religious, regional, or other. In order to understand this issue that we're trying to analyze, we have to understand the framework in which anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism phenomenon takes place, a framework which is marked by the tension between the center and the periphery, or one may say in ideological terms between the universal and the particularist. In other words, in France, it's the political culture in which the tension between the nation state and pluralism is at its highest. It would be important to keep in mind that this bipolar system is governed by the same logic. Particularism is the product of centralism. It is even formatted by it. And hence, Jewish identity appears spontaneously as being an ethnic identity, as a ghetto identity, as the identity of an inferior stratum of society and allogenous to society. So within the French system, there is like a double expectation vis-à-vis the Jew. The Jews are seen first and foremost as being anti-France, those who are the most opposed to the central fusion of the nation state. But at the same time, because they have to be examples, they seem to incarnate the Republican universal character, and that is what I've called a double expectation. This ambivalence, which is a cultural ambivalence, is structured and expressed in different periods in history in a very systematic manner. It generates a very singular system of administering society where the figure or the sign of the Jew becomes a vector of communication of France with itself. This system which is a symbolic or political system, which is at the very root, that is at the very root of modern anti-Semitism in France. I've studied its basic model, that is of that of the emancipation of the Jews in France, in a book written in 1982, The Republic and the Jews, and then again in 1989, the democratic ideal faced with the Holocaust. That system may be summed up in a principle already enunciated by the Abbé Grégoire, which, and I'm quoting that sentence, which is marvelous: the Jews are men like us, and they are men before they are Jews. That is beautiful for whoever reads that sentence very quickly. But if you read it with a certain interest in the symbolic aspect and psychoanalytical approach, this very fundamental idea implies a dissociation, an alarming dissociation between the man and the Jew. Let me explain. At the time of the Abbé Grégoire, it was considered progress to say that Jews were men, and because they were men, they have to be emancipated just like any other men. But the words were pronounced, they said, and they entail some mental framework. And what it entails is that if the Jews are emancipated as men, then man is emancipated and not the Jew as such. And this stands out very clearly throughout the debate on the emancipation of the Jews in public opinion, of the monarchy preceding the revolution. And if, as men, Jews will be emancipated, then Jews as such, as a culture, as a collectivity, as a community, are destined to disappear. And one supposes that with progress, the Jewish people or Jewish culture or the history of the Jews will eventually disappear. In other words, to talk about a system of communication implies that there is a language here, a system of signs, which in its functioning may be independent of the reality that it designates. In other words, the Jewish condition or the condition of the Jews. And that also signifies that this communication system might be instrumentalized for different purposes. And I'd like to say here that the system of the Jewish sign can live independently of what the Jews are, of what the Jews do, or what the Jews say, etc. It has a certain existence of its own within the political symbolical framework of France. And this language of the sign of the Jew can be dissociated of the reality of Jews and French society without at the same time being a mere collective folly. When one talks about a political and social fact as a folly, that is not serious, because we're trying to get out of politics to go into another register, which perhaps is not mistaken, not erroneous, but it is not the key to understand a situation that is not only political. So this is not a pure fantasy or fantasizing of political problems in France and their projection on the figure of the Jew. But I believe that indirectly, there is something rather fundamental here. The symbolic structure of French society, namely that which approaches that in him which cannot be formulated or symbolized. I would not like to resort to Lacanian expressions to talk about the real in Lacanian terms, but if you have that in mind, that too can open a perspective. This symbolic system can be utilized in an instrumental manner by a variety of political actors, which are not necessarily anti-Semitic, but that have understood the utility and productivity of such a symbol. Let's take as an example the humorist, in quotation marks, Dieudonné has understood that if he makes a joke on Jews, he has a fantastic success that is ensured, guaranteed to him automatically. In 2003, in a trial, he said, I have made an effort and I have at one and the same time taken the place. I've taken the place of Jean-Marie Le Pen in the role of the big evil man. And one can see, strangely, how political figures, show business figures, say inadvertently that they are Jews. And so the word Jew is like a symbolic dynamite that ensures, that guarantees an immediate success in that system of communication which is governed by all these precedents. In other words, this autonomy of the system of the Jewish sign, it has a repercussion on the condition, direct repercussion on the condition of the Jew. What we are trying to understand in the framework of that system is that the pre-existence of that very old system and its repercussions on the years 2005, 2006. This has not begun with the Second Intifada, but rather since the middle 80s, early 90s, relating to the preceding figures of that system. So this is really producing a demographic shock. In other words, the arrival into French society of a sizable immigrant population, which is very different from preceding immigrant waves, but at a specific given moment, at the moment when national identity is already very vulnerable due to a certain series of ruptures, of breaks. May 68, the arrival of the ascent of the left to power, the fall of the colonialism, then the failure of the left, and then also the unification of Europe. All of these make the entire concept of the nation state tremble and be very unstable. In other words, the left in power practices or renders anti-racism a substitute, an ideological substitute for lacking social ideology. And François Mitterrand, who tried to break the right and in order to maintain the supremacy of the left. And he really invented the danger of Le Pen and started the movement of SOS Racism to mobilize public opinion. This is what I define as the strategy of the anti-fascist front. And that threat of Hitlerian threat, Mitterrand resuscitates Le Pen or the Hitler-type threat as being the new ideology that threatens society. All the Jewish community and Jewish institutions will become intricated in this ideology, and because education has played an important role. And one of the slogans of SOS Racism established a symbolic equivalence and rhetoric equivalence, which is going to have a long history, namely the Jew is equal to the immigrant. In other words, the Jew appears as the absolute figure of the immigrant. He is identified, Jewish anti-Semitism or anti-Semitism vis-à-vis the Jews is assimilated or compared to anti-Semitism vis-à-vis the Muslims. Arabs are being defined like the Jews, and one resuscitates the entire decor of the Second World War, Nazi ideology, etc. And so a new definition is invented, which is going to go through a whole evolution in the 90s, and it's going to become the lingua franca of political life in France. One will remember that this equation, Jew, immigrant, Arab, once it is done, one can no longer touch on the political reality of immigration, but through this symbolic equation. In 1995 to 1999, the reference to the sign of the Jew is a favorable one, a laudatory one, but after 1999, which is also the year of the bicentennial anniversary of the one and indivisible republic, the figure of the Jew is going to be completely reversed. Immigration is going to be defined as a community, in other words, that which is anti-republic. The Jewish community is assimilated to the community of immigrants, which had never before been done. And this community of immigration appears as being threatening, and the story of the veil is interpreted in that manner. The story of the veil in 1989 is the basic point, and I'd like to remind you that Alain Finkielkraut was a great fighter against the veil in 1990, and a whole range of people who also speak about these matters today. The Jewish community has rejoined the community of immigration in its status of stranger, non-integrated in the state and threatening the state. But this double expectation is expressed once again. At the same time, the left as well as the right presents to the immigrants and presents to them the Jewish community as a model which should inspire them how to integrate within the republic. In other words, the ministers of the left wanted to found the CRIF, which you know as being the representative council of Jewish organizations in France, but for them it was actually the representative council of Muslim communities in France. And that too is very symbolic. So the Jews seem to become dissociated from the rest of French society in order to be presented to Muslim immigrants as the way to integrate into France. And from that moment on, the sign of the Jew becomes the language of the immigrants addressed to France, addressing France. In other words, the communication system in terms of France vis-à-vis the immigrants, but also the immigrants vis-à-vis France. In all this affair, the Jews just are sitting quietly in their own corner. They haven't done anything. They haven't really changed anything. But the immigrants, from that moment on, do not stop to compare themselves to Jews in order to integrate within the French framework. But at the same time, their envy of the Jews rises because, in fact, the political elite in France, the government, presented them with the Jews as a model of imitation, and in other words has started a system of competition between the immigrants and the Jews. So a competitive system is instaured between the Jews and the Muslims from that point on, to the point of becoming a mechanism of administering immigration by the government. This double expectation vis-à-vis the Jewish sign is brought back to life once again. The Jew appears as the absolute incarnation of the republic, so everyone applauds and the Jews are happy, but at the same time represented as the source of the main threat to the republic, and a leader of opinion as Alain, one of the leaders of Le Monde, the newspaper Le Monde, they say that it is through the Jews that all the other communities, the Muslims, the homosexuals, etc., are trying to integrate in French society. And so the Judaism is becoming a sort of a measuring tape for the integration of this group in France, which is at the same time positive and negative. It is negative for minority groups, which are recently newcomers who are trying to adhere to the nation or to be recognized by the nation. And here I'd like to say something. There is a certain ambivalence in reality when the immigrants or the blacks or whatever, you name it, demand that their memory of their trauma be inscribed in national memory. They actually demand entry into national memory. They want to be recognized within the framework of national memory rather than to be separated of it. So this is considered negative for the elites and Republican opinion who try to maintain the continuity of the one indivisible republic. In other words, the sign of the Jew becomes an object of jealousy for some and of rejection for the others. But in the case such as ours, the figure of the Jew remains an object of envy and hence value succeed to the position of the Jews. That is the minority of reference, whereas the Republican elites reject the position of the Jew because they consider them as a measuring tape for other minorities trying to integrate within the state. In other words, the immigrants and the Republicans both interpret differently the significance of that model. This classical system of modern France, the one indivisible republic and the Jew as being the Republican creature, went through a very big crisis with the Vichy regime. And why? Because the Vichy regime, and I'd like to relate here to social morphology, this regime has seen part of the nation, the Jews, come out of citizenship through the means of the government, being actually expulsed from this mechanism of one and indivisible republic. And the Jews are designated as a people that has to be reproached within the framework of French people. The new minorities. So the official repentance of the state is in fact only a moral repentance and auto-culpabilization and recognition of the state of victims of the Jews. Is it 45 minutes already? It is a political act. And here I really rebel against this quasi pseudo-political and moral definition. One has to distinguish between the ethical level and the political level. This competition of sizes the repentance by President Chirac. It is a political act which reinstates the broken unity of the states. Following the withdrawal of the Jews as a group from French society, the immigrants are going to seek in that gesture of repentance, reintegrating the Jews in the state, a model of integration within the national body. And here too the morphological aspect plays a role. In spite of their actual identity of black immigrants, etc., they feel exterior to the state, they have suffered from the state, and one day they entered and integrated within the state, and so little by little they are trying to occupy the place occupied by the victims of the Holocaust in order to gain the same kind of repentance from the part of the state. In 2000, a third phase of that system begins to develop, and which leads to an inevitable anti-Semitism, because the position of the Jews become contradictory. Anti-Semitism becomes possible at that moment because a third term, symbolic term, starts to play a role, which allows to maintain the valorization of the sign of the Jew while allowing different anti-Semitic acts, but which will never manifest themselves as being anti-Semitic. And that third term is Palestine, defined as the people in danger, which allows anti-Semitism to take the shape of anti-Zionism. Palestine enters into the symbolic system as something derived of the Arabo-Islamism, and for the Republican elites as well. So the Republican cause becomes the flag that the Arabo-Muslims populations are brandishing, and a vector of administering by the political elites, of administering these emigrate populations. In other words, we are in a country where things are never given their proper name. They never call a spade, but they give them a different name or nomination. And so Palestine is the new term, and this is followed by a dissociation of the Jewish sign on different levels, and the reference to the Holocaust plays a fantastic role, a very important role. And the group that is to be defended are no longer the Jews, but rather the Palestinians, which entails that people say the universal character of the Shoah and the particular element of the Shoah, the Jew will become the model for the Palestinian. The Zionist Jews or the community Jews occupies the negative role played in the Holocaust. And under the name of the morals of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, the Jew can be accused of Nazism and of being an aggressor. This figure of the Jewish victim of the Shoah as a positive model becomes the axis of a political, symbolical system, and it is going to be copied by other minorities who demand prestige and demand a share of power because of this double meaning of the Palestinian figure, the Palestinian defined by Edward Said as being the victim of the victims, but also the Palestinian as belonging to the Arab or Muslim culture as an ex-colony. The Jewish model is applied to this new configuration in a positive approach. The minorities aspire to accede to the prestige and position of the Jewish minority. They copy the model of the Holocaust, being a slave, having had a Holocaust perpetrated against them, and at the same time they envy the Jews as being those who try to accaparate all the victimization, not leaving them any place. Again, the same morphological scheme can be seen. And in order to conclude, we can understand here the repercussion of multiculturalism on anti-Semitism. Among others, I'd say that the interpretation through this competition of the victims in the last few years is very naive. It is actually trying to resort to an immoderate image of a sociological image without really understanding the logic of modern politics. I have particularly studied this question in my book on the democratic ideal, and a political fact which helps us to understand the situation. The repentance in France, which is shown to the Jews as victims rather than as a collectivity, even though they were excluded collectively of the nation and reintegrated in it collectively. But at a point where one might ask oneself if in the culture of modernity, in the French tradition, this collective or communal identity can be only a symbolic form of a community in the French system. In other words, the identity of a victimized community, can it be the only shape and form of a community of immigrants in French society? To go back to Durkheim, this polarity reflects the negative and positive poles. Durkheim speaks about the secular holy, in other words, the community that's being victimized is the negative hallowed object as opposed to the positive hallowed object, which is defined as the republic or the community of citizens. To return to the foundations of modernity, if the Jews are emancipated as men only, they are being emancipated as men who have suffered, and many authors are accusing Europe for having degraded Jews as men, and men must be emancipated in order to return to be men and in fact stop being Jews. And it is in the name of that human suffering with no identity, with no specificity, that the emancipators claim the emancipation for the Jews, and not in the name of what the Jews are as Jews as such, because universal men, as Burke would say, we've never seen what a universal man is. If Jews are men, they are men as Jews, just in the same way that other men are men while being Muslims. So this secular aspect is something that cannot be ignored. It's an inevitable datum. And I'd like to conclude with a phenomenon that's much more widespread in this difficulty of democracy to administer this notion of collective identity. When this collective identity is denied, the idea of Rousseau is a theoretical opinion that cannot be applied, and even Rousseau knows it. This collective identity that cannot be assumed will very quickly become, in political modernity, with the spring of the nations in 1948, which is the birth of anti-Semitism. And it is very important that national identities and European nationalism come onto the scene at the same time as anti-Semitism, but they return to it in a savage manner under the image of anti-Semitism. And in its foundation, this theory fails to accept the theory of the existence of Jews as a people and as an identity. You do know something about that in today's Israel that is democratic and Jewish. So this theory of this theory was the only one to recognize the Jews, of the conspirative theory was the only way to recognize the Jew. The Jew of the history is always denied and not recognized, while at the same time being suspected of existing, but in an acceptable manner. So we're going from the universal pole to that of particularism. And this is what happens with multiculturalism. When one goes from the universal to the multicultural, this does not change anything in the basic foundations of this lacking system which generated the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. The particularism affirmed today remains in the logic of a universal which engenders the particular. The exclusion of the Jewish sign remains the same, even though it assumes a new modality, and that means that it had nothing to do with an ethnic particularism or national particularism vis-a-vis the universal. What one questions actually is the universal, and within that universal, no longer the question of particularism, but rather of singularity. The phenomenon of collective identity has remained something that people failed to think about, and that which people failed to think about remains the source of this totalitarian approach of this modern era, and which explains that even in the age of multiculturalism, anti-Semitism does not disappear and will not disappear.
Thank you very much. Perhaps just a little contribution that I'd like to make with regard to a key point, although it involves a detail in everything that you've presented us with. I don't know whether you know that the scarf affair was originally the kippah affair because it was born in Créteil. Okay. And there was this problem involving kippah wearing by the pupils at the Versailles school, and the headmaster couldn't do anything, the principal. So he used his secularism and applied it to the scarf or the headscarf instead of kippah. Now I give the floor to Nelly Las. First of all, this will enable us to recognize her work in two senses. She's not only she doesn't only do work on anti-Semitism, but also on feminism. And there are very few people who are involved here, and it's a shame. So I note that Nelly Las is the only woman here this afternoon, and she has this great weight, therefore, on her shoulders, because she is going to add something to an aspect which I think is absolutely vital here. It will show that unless you add the feminist aspect, you can't understand things properly. She is a researcher here in the Vidal Sassoon Center, and she works on a number of items involving the link between feminism and anti-Semitism. Dr. Las. I'm sorry that Professor Wisklicht isn't here, because I wanted to thank him for putting this topic on his program. Generally speaking, when you talk about feminism, in Israel at least, it's only women. And that doesn't bother me, but it means that the men don't know anything about this topic. So this is an opportunity. We've got them, girls. They're trapped, and we're not going to let them out. I'm sure it'll be all right, fellas. So there are three topics I'm going to refer to: secularism, feminism, and anti-Semitism. They have been intertwined in recent years with regard to the social crises that have affected France. I don't know if the mic's smoking. Is that okay? Can you hear me? There's a problem? No? Closer? Ooh. We were saying these three topics, feminism, secularism, and anti-Semitism, have been intertwined in recent years in the context of political and social crises and cultural crises that have affected France in recent years. And as we have just heard, this involved the debate on the Islamic head scarf, or the veil. This is a real symbol. It shows things that have been of concern to France for the last 20-plus years. And we've seen new tendencies, new alliances emerging, new ideological tendencies, feelings, resentments, conflicts of religion, secularism, and memory-based conflicts and Americanization of thinking. What I'm going to show you here is the place of anti-Semitism in the polemic about the Muslim head scarf, showing you the polemic involved with feminists in France. Well, you'll say, if the headscarf has to do with feminism, what does it have to do with anti-Semitism? We will see this is not an artificial choice, and the Jews willy-nilly are caught up in this debate, either in order to strike a balance with Islam or in order to illustrate the thesis of the clash of civilizations that we'll explain shortly. And the fact is that even the Stasi Commission took account of anti-Semitism as the need to ban the headscarf at schools. Stasi was a commission set up in July 2003 by the President of the Republic to examine the way in which the headscarf and secularism could or could not be combined. And there was a law passed subsequently. Well, I won't talk about the headscarf or about secularism specifically. Rather, I'll focus on the last phase of the debate between 2002 and 2004, the criticisms in the awareness that started to develop as to the seriousness of this crisis of secularism. So to start with, I'm going to cite a book here that reflected this beginning of awareness. It's called Les Territoires Perdus de la République, The Lost Territories of the Republic, Anti-Semitism, Racism, Sexism in a School Setting, 2002, by Brenner. Briefly, what we have here are reports from teachers as to the situation in schools with a large Maghreb population, and they talk about the situation with regard to daily anti-Semitism and the trivialization of insults, curses, dirty Jew, and so on, and the refusal to study the Shoah at school. Now, this book, Les Territoires Perdus, refer not only to anti-Semitism, they also talk about despising girls and the threats of rape, which are added to this frightening picture of schools in the Republic. Now, the sexism that Emmanuel Brenner describes at schools is simply a pale reflection of the reality in the suburbs. We have violence there, group rape, fear of brothers, and so on. And the veil, the headscarf there, is a protection against sexual harassment and even against rape. So the girls are respected if they wear the headscarf, and they're protected, therefore, against sexual harassment. Now, this situation was described very courageously by a young girl from one of these suburbs, Samira Rebel, and she wrote a book, L'Enfer des Tournantes, the hell of being a girl in these parts of France. And a 17-year-old girl, a few months after this, called Sohan Benziane, was burnt alive in Vitry-sur-Seine at one of the garbage disposal points. As a feminist friend said to me, before they set fire to cars, they started by setting fire to girls. And this was the beginning of the horror, and there was a group of women that raised an outcry. So in 23 cities, women marched in ghettos for equality. And I cite, in order to alert public opinion with regard to the conditions in which women and girls who are the victims of the laws of the suburbs are subjected. And one of the main goals of this march was to set up a movement called not whores and not submissive. It was a movement. Most Muslims, whether they're observant, whether they're secular, they wish to be integrated. They wish to work without wearing the headscarf. You know, it's not that long ago that in Algeria, the Islamists threw acid at women who dared to go out without wearing the headscarf. And if only out of solidarity with these women who were forced to wear the headscarf in their country, they thought that they should boycott the headscarf. And of course, there are Muslims who do wish to wear the headscarf. They'll either be out of tradition or because their families force them. Others are militants of the veil, of the hijab. And so this is symbolic of the religion, but also of a political point of view. It's a kind of feminine kafir. And they also think that this is feminist style emancipation to wear it. Now I'm going to talk about the position of French feminists with regard to the headscarf, the Islamic headscarf. It may be paradoxical, but we are very far from the consensus, particularly with regard to the law. For most French feminists, the principle of secularism has always been a sine qua non condition of the liberation of women. Although secularism wasn't largely directed at liberating women, because, you know, the women in France didn't get the vote until 1944. They were afraid that they would vote the way their priests vote, and that was one of the main reasons why their political emancipation was held up. However, when it comes to Islam, there are various positions such as third worldism and so on, colonialism, anti-feminism and so on. There are universal approaches, differentialism, and the idea is to oppose the suppression of women represented by the headscarf. Most people, on behalf of secularism, supported the law. There was an article in Le Monde which said that the banning the vote was pro-feminism. But there are more militant people who have a whole range of concepts which have been imported from American universities: post-colonialism, ethnicity, identities, subalternity, dominated, whiteness, which didn't exist in France before. Now people talk about the white, discrimination, stigmatization, paternalism, de-oxidizing or de-westernizing concepts, and Islamophobia. Now, in order to illustrate the use of these terms, I'll give you a little example. Okay. in the list of feminist email list. There's a video that's been sent, and we see how an adulterous woman is stoned in Iran. She's half buried up to her waist, and then she is stoned to death. And someone filmed this, risking their life, and this film is a cry of despair to the West for us to bring pressure to bear on those countries which still apply this Sharia law. Now, the first reaction that was followed by others of the same type, well, who is the world? What is to tell the world? Do you mean by the world the West? And why a custom? Why don't you call it a practice? It's less colonial. And the messages I received is, oh dear, the people living in so-called civilized countries, they think this is barbaric. And you never have any videos here with regard to how women are badly treated in France and so on and so forth. Well, this may look a little folkloric, but if you talk about postmodernism, colonialism, you see they've taken a hold of certain French feminist theorists. Let me start with the arguments by Christine Delphi, one of the founders of the 1970s women's lib movement in France. And in her book, The Main Enemy, she analyzed the oppression of women and the mechanism of masculine domination, which she places above all racial or ethnic forms of oppression. And since the headscarf affair, she's become the greatest advocate for girls with headscarves. And she militates for this in a movement that's close to the Islamists. And she has become a real rallying point for the Islamists who think her a major ally. They invite her to all their seminars and symposia and so on. Now, her argument is that there's an official manufacturing of an Islamist threat and the process of criminalizing Muslims. Women are to be saved despite themselves. They're supposed to be broken away from their families, and this is destruction of Islamic society. If you have a feminist talking about loyalty to tradition, well, I ask you, but it's as if you have a Muslim fighting against Islam. Talis Masreen, who was condemned to death in Bangladesh, and so on. All these women are considered to be disloyal, but you have Islamophobia, which is stigmatizing the Arabs here. Instead of talking about these women who want to turn their backs on the most archaic patriarchal approaches, these feminists are therefore militating in order to allow women, girls, to wear the headscarf at school in order not to stand up to their families. This is a photo taken at a demonstration against the law on the headscarf. And you can see a girl wearing the headscarves here saying, my freedom to practice my religion is not negotiable. And there I quote the few things that were said. Now I come to anti-Semitism. Okay, you can leave it up there. Anti-Semitism now. If we talk about anti-Semitism in France today, it's a very tricky matter, not politically correct. If you're Jewish, you are not allowed to give your opinion in public as to all of these French issues today, unless you present yourself as an anti-Zionist progressive Jew. If you dare talk about anti-Semitism, then the RARD affair will be brought up. That is to say, those who imagine anti-Semitism, or you talk about blackmail, or there's a book, Can One Criticize Israel? Or you will be sent off to consult with Theo Klein, who is, he's the right sort of Jew. On the other hand, if you are Jewish, and you speak out in favor of secularism or women's rights, and you happen to be against the Islamic headscarf, then you're likely to be known as the daughter of Kadosh, because you consider fundamentalism to be something unacceptable. This fiction by Kadosh is considered by everyone, even with the best of intentions, to be a documentary. There's a Orthodox Jewish woman who, because she's sterile, considers that she might as well die, and that's even worse than the stoning of women in Saudi Arabia. Well, I'm going to brave this taboo and talk about this issue in the feminist context. The question is there a clear-cut dividing line between pro and anti headscarfism? And you certainly can't say that if you're against the headscarf, then you are anti-Semitic, or vice versa. There's all sorts of aspects to do with the headscarf. You can talk about Jews who... Well, there's a book that's come out, Conversations between Benny Levy and Uncle Finkelkraut. Alain Finkelkraut was supposed to come and present it, but he was ill this week. And the book is about secularism, among other things. Benny Levy was against the law about the headscarf even before it became a law, and Alain Finkelkraut to this day is absolutely against the headscarf. In other words, he's in favor of a law to ban the Islamic headscarf. And then there are certain feminists who absolutely want to ban anything for women. They say that women mustn't have anything banned as far as they're concerned, so they can do anything they like. They can wear a headscarf and so on. So they're in favor of making prostitution legal and so on. And so there are many, many factors involved here. However, in the report on anti-Semitism, one can make a distinction within current militant feminism to very clear-cut tendencies. And you can see these two forms in a left-wing, but two different types of left-wing reviews journals. One is called Pro-Choice, and the other is Feminist Question. The Pro-Choice journal is against all bad choices: racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia. And this has feminist leanings, and that involves fighting fundamentalism to be vital and to be against anti-Semitism and racism. Along the same lines, we find anti-scarf Muslims who declare publicly that fighting anti-Semitism is something they do as well, and they reject the instrumentalization of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So they're close to SOS racism. They've also taken part in drawing up a manifesto against fundamentalism. And along the same lines, there is a more general manifesto to be of a Muslim culture, means fighting misogyny and so on, and come back to a living form of secularism. And that's signed by French people who reject fundamentalism. However, of course, we're far from a large-scale movement here. Some optimists talk about a silent majority, but trust me, such statements are very limited for the moment. Most people from the Maghreb, whether pro or anti-scarf, are identified with the Palestinians, and their attitude to the Jews relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The most religious ones also have prejudices with regard to the religion. There's a recent study, I don't know if it's been referred to here by Silly Pup, from the political science division on immigrants in France, show that the Muslim prejudices do in fact affect prejudices as far as anti-Semitism are concerned. So young girls with a headscarf who've been influenced by this recording, the cassette that's very widely distributed, do fall into this category. So the Jews are very often presented as criminals and traitors, and they consider the Shoah to be a Jewish conspiracy. So when there's talk of the scarf, very often that gives the opportunity to talk about fundamentalism as well. And you often have well-known anti-Semites there. One, for example, was even expelled because of revisionism and anti-Semitism. And I've just discovered that this woman is in fact Jewish, and quite often the worst anti-Semites are Jewish here too. The other review is New Feminist Question, and it's run by Delphi. She's against all forms of racism except anti-Semitism. In the last edition of this journalism, Sexism and Racism, the French case, there's no reference to anti-Semitism as a form of racism. The only thing she does is to cite Alain, who claims that the lost territories of the Republic imported into France the clash or the war of civilizations, I quote. This is a book by Alain that came out in 2002, Islam, France and the World. And this has 3 chapters which are devoted to demolishing les territoires perdus de la République. It's considered that anti-feminism is a phenomenon of the past. European anti-Semitism, he says, disappeared with my generation before or after the war. Excluding youngsters of Muslim background is the new form of anti-Semitism. The fact that Israel says that the state of all the Jews is what's responsible for anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. She's one of the first signatories or even the initiator of the manifesto with regard to the new youngsters of the Republic. The second example, I have chosen here a different signatory, another signatory of this manifesto, Daniel Salnap. Danielle Salnap, she's fairly well known because of an article she published in Le Monde, an anti-Israeli one, practically an anti-Semitic article. Well, I've chosen her because she really illustrates this paradox of the alliance between militant atheism and support for Islam, which we've seen today with such people as the Quraysh and so on. Danielle Salnap, who's more of a novelist, has written an essay on the topic of God.com. And I met her when she was signing the book. I didn't yet have it, but when you meet her, she's very nice. She likes the Jews and so on. And this book is a eulogy. It praises atheism, and she says the 3 major religions are all hotbeds of obscurantism. Yes, I know there are lots of people who agree with these anti-Semites, and she cites, no, I'm just joking, hang on, but I say this to my son, and he says, yes, I totally agree with you. She cites the worst excesses of Islamic religion, such as polygamy and crimes of honor and so on. But she says the crimes of a religion do not absolve those of another, particularly of Judaism, which applies all sorts of restrictions to women, levirate marriages, the prayer that has a man saying, thank you God for not making me a woman, and so on and so forth. And later on, listen to this, she cites a sentence from Emmanuel Levinas, the philosopher, who says, the woman is the condition of being able to live at home and have proper intimate life and so on. She finds an equivalent in a quotation from Hani Ramadan, Tariq's brother, and she says that woman is the pearl, she is the treasure of the home. And she says, well, look, it's the same thing. You know, and this is the grandson of Hani Ramadan, and he, who set up the Muslim Brotherhood, justified the public stoning of women. And so the conclusion, quote unquote, is that Levinas is probably in favor of stoning. Salnap, unlike Delphi, doesn't like the work multiculturalism. She's in favor of a law against the Islamic headscarf as long as there is a balance struck, and the other religious signs are also banned, including kippah in particular. She loves balance, but she at least can argue against wearing the headscarf, but she can't bear the idea that the Jews should do the same thing. Why? Because they are instrumentalizing this. Now, this is a conspiracy theory. And those who are specialized in suspense films, well, there's a prejudice. Feminism is not pro-porno. Now listen, we've got suspense coming here. Suspense. Now let's hear this. Okay, there's a prejudice already. So one day, Mrs. Sandap read she read a tract against the headscarf on the internet, and the title of the tract was "No to the headscarf, that the law will not pass." Well, there are all the classical arguments against the headscarf. They said it's oppressive, symbol, and so on and so forth. So she herself is against the headscarf, no problem. And then all of a sudden she says, at the beginning I didn't think anything of this, but at the bottom of the tract I discovered a little quote by whom? By Golda Meir. And women wrote at the bottom, they said, as Golda Meir said, we will have peace with the Arabs when they love our children more than they hate them. So I understood it was pro-Israeli women who wrote this tract. It's always the Jews, the defenders of Israel, who use the women's rights and women's dignity and democracy arguments in their speeches. But you go and look at the position of women in Israel. But they said now they have the proof, and I quote this. Strikingly, even if you take the vocabulary, you have this repetition, practically obsessive, of the topic, and you can see that this woman is an unconditional supporter of Israel. Well, she's absolutely convinced of this. Well, why should you go and look for conspiracy? Why should you go and look for ruses and so on? So I wanted actually to conclude on this point, but I will, don't worry, Mr. Chairman, I will conclude with this example from the Sangnab, which is very conclusive and striking. But I happen just to have found an article, don't worry, just 3 lines, by Esther Bensoussan in Libération, and the article is called Why We Mustn't Boycott Hamas. Well, I'm used to these articles, but here, this article, well, I have to say, it's not a political point of view. Sanap is very nice compared with Prémont, but her problem is that well, this article is so hardline, she didn't say, dear reader, and so on. You can believe me because I'm Jewish and I know what I'm talking about. To tell you the truth, yesterday I read a reply to this article that was published, and it's signed by Samir Hareski al-El-Khabib. But from the name, okay, well, he's defending Israel at least against Hamas, against Bensoussan. Well, it's Kabul, so you'll explain that to us. So the explanations are off mic, so we can't hear. Well, obviously, Bensoussan, you expect to attack us, but for Kabul to defend us, is that normal? So I conclude just in a couple of words. Multiculturalism, which is declining in the US now, has really burst onto the French scene. French intellectuals have imported relativism and politically correctness from France that they were ridiculing not that long ago. The defense, tooth and nail, of Islam is such that these people are studying the Quran and looking for attributes and providing Western arguments to these people in order to fight the West. Gresh says 3 times at the beginning he's an atheist, but after that he starts saying that stoning is in the Hadith, it's not in the Surat, and it's a little as if Jean-Paul Sartre, writing about the Jewish question, starts studying Baba Batra, the Talmud, and using arguments of the Quran. And here's this fellow who says he's an atheist. With certain feminists of the same tendency are perfectly prepared to abandon and betray their attitudes. They've forgotten their whole theory of patriarchalism and exploitation, which is good only for the West. Each argument has their own, its own origins, and the debate on the Islamic headscarf has revealed very many aspects. The Jews are on the wrong side, it said, of multiculturalism. The fact that they're classified as whites and oppressors means that they don't have the right to speak. all they can do is speak specifically about certain things, and they say that we should stop talking about about anti-Semitism in order to avoid the war of civilizations. Thank you.
We are somewhat delayed, but I really would like to thank our three speakers who really have respected the time allotted to them. We will take a few questions all the same. What I propose is that as soon as people who want to ask questions, there is a microphone. There are two microphones. What I propose is that we take all the questions all at once, and then the speakers will respond one after the other. I'd like to apologize as of now because I'll have to leave in the middle because my son in half an hour is going to receive his red beret of the paratroopers, and I can't possibly miss that ceremony. You'll have to excuse me. As you can see, we are very militarist. Anyway, the question into a microphone, please, so that you can be translated. To try and explain to us what we, Jewish culturalists, or one of the components of multiculturalism, what are we in all of this? Where are we? Where do we stand? How do we react to society such as it exists today, postmodern society? What is our place in that society? Anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, is it only an historic ethnic identity, or is it something very concrete in a Jewish reality that exists today? And what is that kind of reality, both in the diaspora and in Israel? Perhaps that commands another symposium, but I do believe something should be said. It is not enough to see what happens elsewhere, but who are we in this dilemma? What is our role? Thank you very much. Please ask short questions. That would be appreciated. Microphone, please. A question into the microphone, please. Otherwise, we cannot hear the question and we cannot interpret it. Microphone, please. Okay. Shmuel, I don't know why you made this pro-political discourse because or speech or lecture, because we are in fact confronting very psychological attitudes which take on a political shape. But in your analysis of the discourse, these are choices that are being carried out. And it seems to me, as an American, but when I speak to French people about France in every possible way, we have a feeling of a mentality of resentment, and that expresses itself in a politic of resentment. And it seems to me that this is psychological. I'll stop here. Another question, Toby? It is not really a question, rather a commentary on the lecture by the lady. Madame Las. Is it Las? This is not an adjective, of course. Anyway, since about 20 years ago, we've been saying hijab. And hijab because it's not properly a veil or a scarf, but rather a membrane, because it is also the hymen, and it is in fact the envelope. When somebody is enveloped, when one says about someone that he was born with the amniotic membrane around him, then he's called mahjoub, which means defended or protected. So this notion of this membrane that at the same time is transparent and allows to see the person, but is also protective. That is a beautiful comparison which I wanted to bring to your attention. This is a question addressed mainly to Mr. Emmanuel Brenner. This question, one may be astonished to hear that there is a difference between Muslim intellectuals in France who are also anti-Semitic, just like the uneducated population, contrary to what happens elsewhere. But I believe that today, what we've heard in the other two speeches, this has become among the intellectuals of the left, mostly of the left, to be bon ton, to be anti-Israeli. And it is very easy from that to become anti-Semitic. The passage or the moving from one to the other is a very easy move. And perhaps we should abandon this idea that there are more anti-Semitic people among the uneducated classes as opposed to the educated ones. I do believe this has really changed. Mr. Bensoussan, do you really believe that Europe and Western Europe is already living under a dimitude of Muslims? Are on the way there? Je me demandais si vous pouviez commenter sur le point suivant. Dans quelle mesure les Juifs de France sont-ils concernés? Ressentent-ils qu'il s'agit là simplement, ressentent-ils qu'ils sont un élément, une composante française, ou que peut-être c'est quelque chose de semblable à ce qui arrivait aux Juifs dans les années 60 aux États-Unis lorsqu'il y avait des émeutes à Los Angeles ou ailleurs? Est-ce que quelque chose sur lequel les organisations juives devraient prendre position, devraient faire quelque chose? Doivent-ils défendre les autres minorités? Dans quelle mesure est-ce que les leaders musulmans essayent-ils de protéger les juifs en disant que les juifs ne sont pas vos véritables ennemis, en disant à leurs adeptes que les juifs ne sont pas vos véritables ennemis? Any other question? Would you like to start? These are very far-reaching questions. Why politics? I really abide by my own definition. In the French system, what is really at hand is what I called in my last book, my most recent book, the community identity. This is something that was legitimate in the past and is not legitimate, is no longer legitimate. In other words, the community identity is that which refers to the collective condition of Jews, whether imaginary or not. It has effects, it has sources, and it has effects that are directly political. And based on that political foundation, there are structures, ideological structure, imaginary structure, psychological structures. But this is only the top of the wave. It is rather the core of the problem. And hence, the problem seems to be less a Muslim threat or the collective fantasy that the legitimacy of the Jewish condition in French society as it is confronted with this demographic clash. In other words, it is an aspect that is usually completely hidden because in the discourse and analysis, one usually limits oneself to motivations, analogies, and this is an aspect that is often hidden because one finds it difficult to orient oneself and to accept what the Jews are. In everything that I told you, the basic hypothesis is that the Jews are a people that did not find its place in modern politics and to witness the modern anti-Zionism. In other words, we are really attesting a very alarming condition that bears on the political fact itself. Multiculturalism must find its place in that rather vast perspective, and that is why the political dimension seems to me of great importance. It enables us to understand in a fantastic way why anti-Semitism today is equal to anti-Zionism, why anti-Semitism today takes the shape and form of anti-Zionism, because as long as Jews were not autonomous, were not people defined as such, and they were dispersed by the nations and among the nations, well, they were the source of their own trouble. The idea of illness, C. Pinsker and other thinkers. But today that they are a nation and a state, the front of anti-Semitism has moved and recomposed itself, and that is what we could see during the second Intifada, the appearance of a new front. And here I'm responding to my friend. I'm not sure I know what you mean by when you use multiculturalism, but that the Jews are considered a target. This is not only the Jewish nation state, but this is rather the eternal Jew, and we have a convergence here with the antique model of anti-Judaism, religious anti-Judaism, which seem to have disappeared behind this modern form of anti-Semitism. And as to what should we do, unfortunately, I have to say that Israelis are rather absent from that front because they want to be recognized as what they would like to be, but others see them as what they are in spite of themselves. So there is a lack of coordination on that level, which entails that the Jews are pursuing or seeking some targets which do not correspond to their own immediate interest, political, historic, etc. But that is a very serious problem. Well, I'm waiting for you to organize another symposium in Israel on that question alone. But is France on the way to demitude or not? Well, I believe that in a certain way, what could we see in 2001? We had the feeling, we Jews, that France and the public institutions, public opinion, was abandoning us in order to pacify the Arab world. And this is reflected in the Arab population in France. And as Betty Orr, the daughter of the Nile, has explained it so beautifully, this attitude is withdrawing, is regressing. And all the Jewish intelligentsia, which is trying to go back on the idea of the Jewish people, the Jewish community, etc., has spontaneously adopted the clothing of the dhimmi. In other words, they ask the victim not to make a pact with its enemy, but also not to be a dhimmi at the same time. This has become the scheme of the political powers in France, which are using the Jews to pacify the Muslims and provide them with a good conduct certificate. At the same time, the institution of Marseille Espérance, for instance, or of political facts such as the meeting of the CRIF and the UOF, the Muslim Brothers, the initiative of Rabbi Tzarfati and the friendship with the Muslims, and the interreligious dialogue has been instrumentalized in order to serve aims and targets that ought to have been addressed by the government. government, in fact, relegates these issues to religions, and religion has become the pretext and inevitable justification, because these are old French, veteran French, and they say if the Jews are inside, one cannot be accused, one cannot say that Islam is involved. In other words, this problem of this equation that I have analyzed has direct repercussions on the way of running the politics of the French political powers. I believe I have answered all the questions that were addressed to me, says Professor Trigano. In 2 words, to respond to 2 points which have been raised and I'd like to respond to. One on dimitude. One ought to get out of the context of the Jews in France. It's France as a whole that is actually sinking into dimitude, not only the Jews. One should bear in mind the Munich spirit, this spirit that expresses itself in France with the defeat of 1940, the bloodshed while abandoning the colonies. And so this road to decadence, the French foreign policy has remained very weak and is paving the way to dimitude, faced with an immigration offensive and demographic offensive. And I really don't know how one can talk about politics without talking about demography. The Muslim population today is officially about 8% today, whereas in other countries it is less than 2%. In France, it is going beyond 8% already. So one should bear in mind all these elements in order to understand and conclude that we are going towards dimitude in France. The second point, someone mentioned anti-Semitic prejudice, and I'd like to give you an example to tell you that, in my opinion, these are not two identical things. Prejudice, are you a Jew or not a Jew? This remains very anti-Jewish in France, whereas intellectuals, those who have studies, this position is actually regressing. So anti-Semitism, which is very common in intellectual circles, should not be mixed with criticism of Israel. Of course, not every criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. One might speak about it for a whole day, but the politics of Israeli government criticizing it does not necessarily mean that one is anti-Semitic. And interpreting as such is falling under this Jewish paranoia and becoming automatically a victim, and because one reasons exactly in the same circular manner as the person who tries to criticize the Jew. That's all I wanted to say.
Je vais d'abord répondre à Monsieur
Mr. Tobin-Nathan, I'd like to answer you. In France, we use the word foulard, scarf, and veil. These are the most common terms in France. Le hijab, I did not express an opinion. The question was the hijab in school, sometimes in elementary school, and it was an entire context. But the fact that the hijab is connected to hymen, I would tell you that hymen and the history of hijab that has provoked hundreds and thousands of women who were massacred because of that. It is a very grave problem in Arab countries. It is perhaps anthropologically beautiful, but you were only referring to the term, the vocabulary. Okay, I thought you were defending the idea behind it. No, I understand. Well, Mr. Tobin-Nathan is not speaking to a microphone. I was relating to the debate in France, and this term is very rarely used in France, hijab. Thank you. Well, you've taught us something. Thank you. because I thought that maybe you were trying to defend the idea, but I understand it was a mere semantic discussion. As far as multiculturalism is concerned, multiculturalism was positive even for Jews, because the problem was raised mainly in the United States that allowed them to have their own identity. But the big problem is that multiculturalism has been connected to those who are cursed, those who are poor. And one can see that in France there are so many Jews who wish to maintain their identity and wear their kippah, and today they're hiding within the context of multiculturalism. In other words, multiculturalism should have ensured, guaranteed equality for the Jews. Should have been good for the Jews, should have been positive for the Jews. They would have wanted to have the kippah allowed, and really they couldn't care less about the veil being worn in school. But there was that problem in the United States as well as in France. In Israel, I don't think so. I'm not speaking about Arabs. In Israel, it doesn't disturb anyone if someone wants to wear a hijab in school or university or anywhere else. It's different. Thank you.